Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 12 of EDC 420. This week, we are continuing our learning around assessment by looking specifically at the challenges and consequences of standardized assessment for multilingual learners. So we'll begin with a slightly different way of beginning the week with a podcast episode, which does not specifically focus on MLL students, but I think it does a really nice job of helping us think about the consequences of standardized assessments and also more broadly about the purpose of schooling. In particular, in the episode, they talk about high school, but kind of what are schools for? And then what is the role of standardized assessments in helping us to accomplish those purposes as they are defined. And I think it offers us some really important insights as we think about assessment for MLLs and the purpose of education for those students as well. We will move from the podcast to two readings for this week. In the first, you'll be reading an article by Solano Flores, where he gives a really nice analysis of standardized assessment for MLLs through asking a series of critical questions, including who is the population that we're talking about? So how do we define and classify multilingual learners? What tests are used and what are some of the limitations of those tests? How do we think about language in relation to validity and what we're measuring? Who is the one administering the test and developing the test, and where there are some challenges there? How often should we be assessing MLLs, and also how might the specific sociolinguistic context impact assessment for MLLs? So I think these are some really interesting questions to consider as we continue learning about assessment, but also as we think about the standardized language assessment critique paper that you'll be working on. After engaging with Solano Flores' article, we're going to read an article from Bailey and Carroll, in which they look at the system of English language learner assessment and the connection between language and content assessment. For those of you who have taken EDC 501 already, excuse me, you may be familiar with the way in which, the process in which multilingual learners or English learners are identified, and then placed in a language service program, and then monitored and eventually exited from being an ML or an ELL. If this is new to you, this article will give you an introduction into what that process is. And what I like about Bailey and Carroll's article is they do a nice job not only of reviewing the process, but also thinking about how at each stage we can ask some really critical questions about how we are defining students and how we're thinking about our assessment tools that we're using. So you'll gain a deeper dive into that process. And then they also, in the article, talk about kind of this intersection of language and content, and how do we disentangle the two? Can we really? And they especially point to some of the newer standards like Common Core State Standards, and some newer science standards, next generation science standards, which really do bring language more to the forefront of content learning. And so given that, what does it look like to begin to measure what a student can do in content in a content area when language is such a key part of that, right? And always has been, but is increasingly emphasized in that way. And I did note on our Brightspace page, both of these articles are fairly dated, but I think they still have a lot of importance and ongoing relevance for our understanding today. But I did clarify, the Bailey's article. Bailey and Carroll talk about No Child Left Behind, which was replaced by the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, although most of the policies and procedures and processes that go with that act, with No Child Left Behind, have been retained in ESSA. But just so you know that is the new guidance, legislation guiding how we think about accountability. And I noted at the very beginning of our Brightspace page, for those of you who have only been teaching since No Child Left Behind, or for some of you who've only been students since No Child Left Behind was passed, this isn't what school has always looked like. We are living in an era of high stakes assessment, where students are assessed more than they ever have before in the history of schooling. And certainly there's some benefits to this kind of progress monitoring. But as we talked about a little bit last week, and as you'll definitely see this week, there's a lot of challenges with this kind of high stakes assessment, and the way that we're defining what success is in a very narrow way, and then what that data is actually used to do. We know that the term high stakes we use that because this data has consequences, right? It can limit whether or not somebody graduates, as the podcast talks about. It might limit what kind of programming somebody can receive. And in some states, being identified as an MLL through a high stakes assessment means you might receive a very narrow programming, English language services. As a result. And so not having accurate measures of what a student knows and can do can change the trajectory of their educational experience quite dramatically. And certainly now we know that it's not just at the student level, but at school level, funding decisions are tied to high stakes assessment. Whether or not a school closes and the rating that a school has are often tied to high stakes assessments. So I think it really is important for us as educational professionals to have an understanding of what these tests are, what their strengths are, and also where they have limitations, especially when it comes to teaching and working with MLLs. With that, moving into the application for this week, I did want to note there is an optional reading if you would like to look at it as well about long-term English learners that I think is worth a read. But the other two readings for this week are fairly heavy, so I wanted to not give you too much additional content. Moving to discussing and reflecting. You have a couple of discussion questions to think about and to engage with as you apply your learning. And then from there, I would just love for you to start working on your standardized assessment critique. So look again at the rubric and the assignment description. Spend some time thinking about what you've been learning so far up to this point about SLA theory and concepts that could apply to your analysis. Decide which assessment you want to focus on, and then start doing some learning about that assessment, because you're going to want to deconstructing kind of the different components of it and thinking about what it's measuring and how it's measuring that as you think about questions like validity and bias. And then I did provide a sample paper just so you can see what one looks like, although I encourage you to not see that as the only way to approach this paper, but just to get some ideas for one way that you can. Yeah, and that's this week. So I hope you enjoy diving into the content around assessment, and I look forward to seeing your thoughts on the discussion forum.